My name is Sima Kahn, and I am on the steering committee for this conference, and I am just moderating this discussion. I'm not an expert in any of these three bodies of law. We are missing our third panelist, but we're going to get started anyway. So I'm going to briefly introduce all three in the hopes that Rabbi Mirel will show up any second. And each person will talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I have somebody who will bring a microphone around to project the questions so everyone can hear them. So just to my right is Jim Brooks. He has a Master's of Divinity dealing with dogmatic and moral theology and canon law, and a Master's of Education and Counseling from Seattle University. He's been involved with the Matrimonial Tribunal for the Catholic Archdiocese of Seattle for 30 years, the past 15 years as a collegial judge. And besides serving as a judge for the Archdiocese of Seattle, he's a judge on the Appeals Court for the Archdiocese of Portland, Oregon, for the two dioceses of Alaska and the dioceses of Yakima and Spokane. So he's going to give us an introduction to canon law. To his right is Salah Dandan. He's a lawyer with a practice in the Seattle area. He is of counsel to a Saudi Arabia-based law firm. And in the course of his practice, he advises multinational corporations on Saudi law and Sharia issues. Previously, he was a director of intellectual property ventures at Microsoft. Salah has a law degree from the University of California, Hastings College of Law, and a BA in political science from the University of California in San Diego, which is my alma mater also. He's got a postgraduate diploma in Sharia law and practice from the International Islamic University, Malaysia, where he also taught law school courses on contracts and intellectual property. And guess what? He's going to talk to us about Sharia. And last but not least, and hopefully he will be here soon, is Rabbi James Mirel. He's the senior rabbi of Temple B'nai Torah in Bellevue. He's the president of the Washington State Coalition of Rabbis. He's the author of Stepping Stones to Jewish Spiritual Living and a frequent lecturer at colleges and churches throughout the state. And he's going to talk to us about halakha, Jewish law. So I'm going to give the microphone to Jim Brooks to talk to us about canon law.
And I'm going to pass it to... That was our agreement.
Well, we thought we should do this by order of revelation. So you want to go for it?
Go ahead.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon, and I hope I'll be able to address some of the issues that you're interested in relating to Sharia. So my plan is that the introductory remarks will be rather brief, but hopefully set a tone and context about Sharia law, so that we could have a more hopefully engaging, hopefully informative discussion in the question and hopefully answer session. So that's the plan. I hope that works for you, and we'll proceed and see where we go from there. I have to say that part of the shortcomings of my background is that my interaction with Sharia has been mostly from the commercial sense. I've advised companies who are interested in Sharia law issues relating to large contracts, infrastructure projects, sometimes software, intellectual property issues, and currently also Islamic finance. There's a great deal of interest in Islamic finance and Islamic financial instruments. It's definitely a growing area, and I currently advise a private equity firm based in New York on structuring a Sharia-compliant Islamic private equity fund. So these are areas where there is quite a bit of interest. I promise not to bore you about issues relating to finance here, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss things that are consistent with the theme of the conference and are consistent and hopefully responsive to your interest in here. So I think first things first, I'll start with a little bit of definitions because I'm using, and I'm going to be continuing to use some foreign sounding words. So excuse me for that, and I'll try as much as possible to provide a ongoing glossary and hopefully refresh your memory about that glossary as we go forward. So Sharia is an Arabic derived term, and in Arabic, Sharia comes from Shara or Sharia. So basically, it means linguistically, it means the path or the way. A street is Sharia, very close to Sharia. So it means something of the nature of a path or of a way. And the way the term Sharia appears in the Quran, it's really very interesting, and it's where the word Sharia or Shara comes in the Quran. It's in the context of linking up or establishing a tie between Islam and the previously revealed religions. So this is why it would have been better for you to go first. Because in the Quran it says that He has ordained, and ordained in this context is Shara'a, so from Sharia. He has made as part of the Sharia, He has ordained for you in matters of faith that which He had enjoined upon Noah, and unto which we gave you insight through revelation, as well as that which we had enjoined or ordained or Shara upon Abraham and Moses and Jesus. Steadfastly uphold the faith and do not break up your unity therein. So it's a context of the Shara, and the Sharia is tied to the previous revelation. It's tied to the ongoing series of messengers and prophets that God has sent throughout the ages. So it's not an entirely or altogether new body of law, just as Islam is not a new religion in the sense that it's a continuation of previous messages and previous bodies of teaching. So the Sharia is, and we've heard throughout this conference several discussions and explanations of definitions of the Sharia, but largely Sharia can be broadly divided into three areas. So the first area is that of creed, or the system of beliefs in one God, a messenger, prophet, etc. The second one is the whole concept of ethics and morality, and the relationship between the creation and the creator. So the acts of worship, this whole concept of God consciousness, taqwa in Arabic. And a third part of Sharia is that which is revealed, or which relates to specific acts of worship, so ibadat, so things like how you give the charity or alms, or how you perform prayers, things that have certain rules associated with them, and mu'amalat, which means transactions or interaction with other human beings. So this is where the whole body of commercial law comes in, contracts, other types of transactions, but also criminal laws and things where it's about the relationship between man and fellow man, or fellow human beings. And so that's really in large the three parts of Sharia: the creed, the ethics and morality, and then the acts of worship and the transactions or the commercial and other types of interaction. Now, throughout the ages, Muslim scholars have opined as to what exactly is the Sharia, or what's the best way to define Sharia. And one of the definitions I really like, and I feel really relevant to me as an American Muslim, is definition of Sharia that's tied to the concept of justice. And that definition comes not from me, but from a scholar, Ibn al-Qayyim, who wrote in sort of the Middle Ages of Islamic scholarship, where he says that wherever signs of justice manifest themselves by any means, then you will find the Sharia of Allah and His religion. So the definition that Ibn al-Qayyim gave of Sharia is, look for justice and you will find Sharia. He didn't say look for Muslims, he didn't say look for Islam, or he didn't say look for any of it. Look for justice, and where you find justice is where you will find Sharia. So this is really important, because Sharia cannot be separated from justice and cannot be separated from the concept of morality. And one of the things that really frustrates me very deeply as a Muslim is that I often see people make declarations in the name of Islam, or say something is ruled upon one way or another in Sharia based on a notion of legality or legalisms, if you will, without really looking at the notion of justice or morality. And sometimes this leads to situations where somebody can say, well, this is in accordance with Sharia, while if you really look into the net effect of such a ruling, you will find that such a ruling would be devoid of justice, and in some cases, unfortunately, devoid of morality, which would make it necessarily contrary to Sharia and to the purposes and to the whole point of Sharia. Now, I'm going to throw at you another term that's, I think is going to be important because we may refer to it in the Q&A session, and that's fiqh. Fiqh and Sharia are very often confused, even among the, even within the Muslims and even within native Arabic speakers. Now, fiqh means or is that corpus or that body of law that relates to specific rulings on things like worship, ibadat, as we mentioned before, and transactions. And it's about discerning what's permissible and what's not permissible, what's halal, permissible, and what's haram, non-permissible, and what's valid versus what's void. So fiqh is really this whole body of law, this whole knowledge base that has been collected over about 15 centuries of Islamic scholarship and Islamic legal rulings. So these two are very distinct terms. Sharia, the path, the way, relates to things such as morality, creed, also relates to general concepts of interactions, and fiqh, which is a body of rulings.
Could you spell that for us?
Sure. My apologies. I wish I had a F-I-Q-H. That's the acceptable transliteration of it. F-I-Q-H, fiqh. And like I said, often this distinction between Sharia and fiqh isn't necessarily very obvious, but it's really one that's very important, and I think we'll be referring to it. And all right, I promised I'll keep this brief, so let me try to stick to my promises. That's part of the Sharia as well. The sources. The sources of Sharia, when we're looking as to where does the Sharia come from, really, one way of looking at it is to say there are really two sources of Sharia. There is the revelation, and there is reason. And both are considered to be important sources, and in some cases of equal weight, other cases not, but some cases of equal weight within the Sharia. So the sources that are related to revelation, this would be the Quran, the Muslim holy book, the Sunnah. Now, the Sunnah means the sayings, Sunnah, S-U-N-N-A-H, means the sayings, the actions, the rulings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Another source of Sharia that's from revelation, and this varies depending on the Muslim schools of thought, is a source in previous revelation. So if we're looking into a matter and we don't find any discussion of that issue within the Quran or the Sunnah, we look into what does the Bible say about this, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament and other books of revelation. And that's also considered a legitimate and weighty source of Sharia. Now, in the side of reason, the overarching source of Sharia, the size of reason, it's called ijtihad. Again, my apologies, more Arabic terms, I-J-T-I-H-A-D. Ijtihad means, and you may find some similarity ijtihad and jihad, because in both cases it means a struggle or an effort. So ijtihad means an effort at reasoning, an effort at coming to a ruling based on reason. And ijtihad is not, you know, I sit in a corner, I think about this, and I come up with a solution to it, and it becomes part of Sharia. No, ijtihad is more, throughout the development of Sharia, ijtihad, there have been certain vehicles for this type of reasoning. So one of the vehicles would be consensus. What does the consensus of the scholars think or say about something like this? 2 minutes, okay. That should be fine. Analogy is another source. I'll give you an example for analogy. So in the Quran, it's very explicit about the prohibition against alcohol as an intoxicant, but it says nothing about pot. So So Muslim scholars have drawn the analogy between an intoxicant that's strong versus one that's smoked, and etc. There's public policy, and public policy is a very important one, trying to look at where the interest of the people is. And then there's this concept of custom. What is the custom that is established and that is accepted? So in many cases, and many Muslims do not know this, but in many cases, some of the rulings and the methods that are used commonly and viewed as part of the Sharia existed even in pre-Islamic Arabia. That's because it was a custom that was not contrary to the Sharia, or that did not run afoul to the laws of the Sharia, and is therefore seen as part of the Sharia. The purposes of Sharia are, and we may have heard this yesterday in the discussion, in the speech by Imam Faisal Raouf, it's really the advancement and the protection or safeguarding of faith, of the belief system, of life, of wealth, property, of lineage, morality, family-related issues, and of the intellect. So really these 5 things are where, based on the examination of the whole body of Sharia by various centuries of scholars, the scholars have basically said, if you look at the Sharia in its totality, it has to run around one of these things. It has to be either about protecting life, so this is where all the rules against, murder, things like that, about protecting the faith, and this is where, for instance, in Islam, it's very clear there's a commandment not to compel people to believe in a God other than the one, or in a system of belief other than the one that they have adopted. The whole concept of no compulsion in religion is part of the Sharia, and it's part of this whole notion of protecting and advancing faith. So there's also, like I said, wealth, lineage, morality, intellect, etc. The relationship of Sharia to others, I think we touched briefly in the beginning about the relationship of Sharia to other systems of revelation, and obviously that's enshrined, that's part of the Islamic teachings, and within that there's a whole concept of rights of religious minorities, which is why throughout Islamic history and until today in many Islamic countries you would find that non-Muslim minorities have their own court system, where they go in for issues relating to divorce and inheritance and other types of issues. But even further, in Egypt, for instance, the Coptic Church can even go beyond inheritance and divorce to issues even of, it can even incarcerate people. So you have developed a whole concept of religious minorities, and the whole notion of interaction of Sharia with local laws, essentially the law of the land. And I think this is where we're going to be talking, I hope, quite a bit more in the question and answer session about how does Sharia, what relevance does Sharia have in the life of a Muslim here in the United States? How does Sharia interact with the laws, the federal laws, the state laws, etc. So hopefully we'll address all of these at the Q&A. And I look forward to the discussion at that point.
You want some of my minutes?
I'm good.
We're going to talk about canon law. And in the church's canon law, there are 1,752 canons. And that's not exactly divine revelation, but it covers every aspect of church life. And if you notice, with regards to, there's something like 54 million Catholics in this country, and there's some over 500,000 Catholics in the Archdiocese of Seattle, and that's a lot. And what I want to talk about with regards to the question of canon law, because I deal strictly in the question of canon law in marriage, and I deal strictly in canon law with regards to the question of people who have been married before and wish to be married again, and there can be a problem. And the problem is that the constant teaching of the Catholic Church has always been, and this is divine revelation, that marriage is permanent, that marriage is indissoluble, that you are not free to remarry, that divorce and remarriage is not acceptable to the Catholic Church. And that creates a lot of problems for Catholics today. Now, when I grew up, which is quite a long time ago, and I was raised in Rainier Valley, and we used to call that Garlic Gulch. And we had various, ethnic parts of the city where, and I happen to live, I'm Irish, but I happen to live with all the Italians. And when I was a kid, there were very strict rules with regards to the question of being Catholic and living a Catholic life, which meant, for instance, you went to Mass every Sunday, you went to confession at least once a month, you didn't eat meat on Fridays, and you fasted during Lent and sometimes during Advent. And so it was pretty cut and dry as to what it meant to be Catholic. And there was also the question of marriage in the Catholic Church. Once you were married in the Catholic Church, there was absolutely there was no second chance, so to speak. Something would have to be very, very, well, it didn't happen. My parents were divorced, and my father wanted to marry again, and he couldn't. My mother did marry again, and she married outside the church. And then things kind of began to change slowly but surely. And we defined marriage with regards to the question of marriage for the Catholic is a contract. And how do you break a contract? And the primary purpose of marriage is the procreation of children. I come from a family of 6. And I don't know if you read the Seattle Times last week, but they had a whole article in there of what they call Catholic Hill, which is just right over here. And the idea of 6, 7, 8, 9 kids in a Catholic family was not unusual in those days. But today that's changed quite a bit. And it's because of what I would, I'll talk a little bit about, maybe some of you have heard of the Second Vatican Council that took place in 1962, from 1962 to 1965. And that changed quite a bit, not with regards to the teaching of the Catholic Church, with regards to the permanence of marriage and what were the elements of entering into a marriage, which would be that it's permanent, that fidelity is an integral aspect of Catholic life, and that the possibility and being open to the possibility of children must be there in order to marry in the Catholic Church. The other aspect with regards to marriage in the Catholic Church is Catholics began to marry non-Catholics more frequently than what it used to be. For instance, when I was a kid, you didn't marry outside the church. And then if you wanted to get married to a non-Catholic, and my wife's parents, that was the way they started off, they had to get married in a rectory. And they went to Eastern Washington to do that. Then we kind of progressed a little bit, and so you could get married in the back of the church. And then you could get married in front of the church, but outside the communion rail. We used to have communion rails in the days. And then we progressed to the time when you could get married inside the communion rail. And that happened because we didn't have any more communion rails. And then the other part of it is the fact that, that whether you were Catholic or non-Catholic, and if you wanted to be married in the church, you were married by a priest. And non-Catholics had to accept the fact that they had to be married before a priest if they wanted to marry a Catholic. They also had to promise that they would raise the children as Catholic. That's changed in the sense that today, for a good reason, and if you can get the permission of your bishop, the Catholic Church must witness a Catholic marriage in some way. But it doesn't always mean that it must be a priest or a deacon. I did a marriage case not too long ago in which they were married in a Methodist church by a Methodist minister with a dispensation from the bishop. There was a very good reason for that, and that was that the girl's mother was dying and she wanted to be married in her hometown, and we would allow that. But you must go through the bishop in order to do that. The Second Vatican Council also changed the whole idea of not the teaching with regards to that marriage is indissoluble or permanent, but the question of what makes a marriage, our understanding of what marriage is. I said marriage before the Second Vatican Council was a contract. In the Second Vatican Council, we changed that definition. There is a contractual element, but marriage was returned to its true biblical, sacramental, Christian understanding that marriage is a covenant between a man and a woman. And there's no hierarchy of value with regards to the question of children. You marry because you love somebody. And in that love, you bring in children into the world. And your responsibility is not only to bring children into the world, but to raise them in a Christian home, in a Catholic Christian home. So that changed with regards to the whole idea. Covenant is a biblical term. And if you understand what covenant means, then you understand the deep meaning of marriage and what it takes to be married and to stay married. And that's where my role comes in with regards to working in the tribunal. Now, another point, with 2 minutes? Okay, another point is that the Catholic Church recognizes all marriages as valid. We do not make a distinction between Catholics and non-Catholics. All marriages are valid marriages. And therefore, half the cases that I do and as a judge in the tribunal are for non-Catholics who have been married before and now want to be married to a Catholic in the Catholic Church. That didn't used to happen, but it happens much more frequently now. And with regards to the question of what people understanding as an annulments, and I don't like to use that word, and I don't have a lot of time to explain what it means, but annulment is not a proper word, because what it means is that something never happened. And when people come and ask for what I call a declaration of invalidity to their marriage, we're not saying that something didn't happen. And it has nothing to do with children. We are not wiping out 25 or 30 years of married life or whatever it is. We're not saying that it never existed. What we are saying is that something went terribly wrong. There was an element in that marriage that did not exist as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, and we need to look at that, and that's kind of what I do with regards to, as a judge for the tribunal. And it's a process that Catholics and non-Catholics have to go through. The tribunal is set up mostly for Catholics, but today, with non-Catholics, coming into the church who have been married before, there's a lot more that we have to do in that area. So that's pretty much what I do. So I'm not sure how that relates to Sharia law and to the Jewish understanding of marriage, so I'll let the others take over.
Thank you.
No, Tim. My name is James Mirel. I apologize for being late. I got most of what you said. Very beautiful. Got all of what you said. I have a good excuse. It's Shabbat. I was in the synagogue, so I wasn't doing anything illicit. I was praying. But I got here a little bit late. So I'm going to keep it to 10 minutes and keep it really short and I hope sweet, asking just a few questions, and I want you to answer them, not aloud. These are rhetorical questions, but answer in your own mind. Do you prefer to live in a society where there is law or where there is no law? All right? Now think about that. I hope everybody's answering. I definitely want to live in a society where there is law. We don't want to go back to the Wild West. We want to live in a society of law. Do you want to live in a society which is run by a religious law? And I think that might be a little bit harder question because you might have a different answer to that. But I think that most people in this room would say, we don't want to live according to religious law. of one particular religion because we're a secular democracy. We want to live by secular law, civil law. That's the American way. I like it. So the third question is, given that fact, how does canon law, Sharia, Jewish law, halakha, fit into a secular democracy? That's the critical question. I don't think that most of us here want to live in a society run by religious law. Maybe some do. But I think we like our society the way it is. But we also want to say that there is an absolute right for religious freedom. I think that's another question. Do we agree with that? I think so. There may be a little bit of a gray area there we'll talk about. Halakha, Jewish law, can operate within the construct of secular democratic society. How so? Jews who choose follow halakha, religious Jewish law. That is their freedom as Jews. Sharia could be followed by Muslims voluntarily. That's their choice. I'm not trying to impose halakha on the entire society. It is exclusively for Jews. It's a Jewish law for Jews, for those who choose to follow it. I would say, in the same way, canon law is for Christians who choose to follow it. Sharia is for Muslims who choose to follow it. So the fourth question is, I'm not going to get into the specifics of Jewish law, don't have enough time for that in 10 minutes, but the question is there a case where Jewish law will come in conflict with secular law set by the Constitution, by legislature, by court precedents? If so, how do we resolve that issue? 99.4% of the time, there will be no conflict. Jewish law can be followed by Jews without any conflict with secular law. I imagine that's true with Sharia, canon law as well. Very rare there'll be direct conflict. But how do you resolve that? A few times, but there might be a conflict. Well, one way to resolve it, and it's very brief, is for someone to opt out. If you're a Muslim, you choose not to follow Sharia law, live in the United States, you're a free citizen, you can opt out of it. Jew, you can opt out of halakha if you want to. Let's say you don't want to. You want to follow Sharia, you want to follow canon law, you want to find halakha, there's a conflict. We can speculate on what the conflict would be. There's a general principle in Jewish law. Dina de malchuta dina. It's almost simplistic, but I want to tell you what it means. The law of the land is the law. In other words, in most cases, Jewish law should conform with societal law. And if there is a conflict, generally, societal law will take precedence over Jewish law, in general. That takes into care of another 0.3%. But there might be 2.2% where that's going to create a conflict. And that's going to be the difficult cases where that's what law is all about, the difficult cases, right? So, for example, there is another concept. There's a difference between that which is permitted and that which is required. So, for example, in Sharia, maybe in halakha, we can talk about it, you could be permitted to have more than one wife. Why anybody would want more than one wife is a different question. But you're permitted to have more than one wife, all right? But if secular law says you cannot have polygamy, you can only have one wife, Jewish law would say, dina de malchuta dina. We're not required to have more than one wife. We might be permitted to by halakha, but Jewish law, but the secular law says you cannot. So there's no conflict. We conform to secular law on an issue that is a matter of permission. You're not required to do it. So you restrict yourself according to secular law. Makes sense to me. But there are a few little cases that could be problematic, and I'm sure it's true in Sharia as well. And this is something that's historically also the case. What if secular law says you're not permitted to circumcise a child? Well, there's many countries that say that, or would like to say that. You cannot circumcise a child. That's not permitted. It's not medically indicated. It's something that's not cruel and unusual. It's something that's dangerous, something that has no value. You're not allowed to do it. Jewish law says you must circumcise your child. So what do? That's the 0.1% that's going to be a problem. A Jew living in a secular democracy, or a monarchy for that matter, the Jewish law is direct conflict with the law of the land. That's going to be the tough issue. Tough issue for Sharia too, I'm sure. Tough issue for canon law too. Can you break the law if you're required by the Jewish law to do something that the secular law says you can't do? Now, I'm not going to answer that question, because I want you to think about it. I want you to think about it. What would you do? You have a law that you believe in your religion is the law, the God-given law, you might say, the law of tradition, the law of halakha, the law of Sharia, the law of canon law, but the secular society says you cannot do it. That's where the problem lies. But you know something? Life has problems. And we'll figure them out. We'll figure them out. But just on a very serious note, when the Romans in ancient times, or when the Greco-Seleucid Empire during the Maccabean time said, you cannot circumcise your children, that was a major threat to Jewish existence. And people were willing to sacrifice and risk their own life to follow that law, because they felt they were required by God to do it. And some authority, which was an outside authority, could not mandate a change. Is that true in secular democratic society as well? It's worth talking about. So those are the kind of basic issues. But remember the basic rule of halakha, dina de malchuta dina. The law of the land is the law.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions now, and we'll have someone bring the microphone, and if you could let us know who you're addressing the question to. It may be obvious, but if it's not, we'd love to know who. And since you're the first hand that I saw, Doug, over there.
Thank you. My question is for our Muslim brother. Does Sharia law vary from country to country and from culture to culture, or is that something that is generally agreed upon in the Muslim world, as vast as it is?
Okay, that's a great question, and that's exactly why I planted the seed in my discussion about the distinction between Sharia and fiqh. Fiqh being the body of jurisprudence. So I would say in a very, very simplistic way, and I'll add some nuance to it. The Sharia doesn't vary because the Sharia is one and universal, but that the body of law, the fiqh, the corpus of jurisprudence would vary because by necessity jurisprudence and these questions of fiqh are dependent upon the time, the age in which such an issue arose, the locale, the type of environment that Muslims have lived in. And when there was an attempt at a certain point in Islamic history during the Ottoman Empire to write down the collection of Islamic laws in some form, there was one of the things that were written down is that fiqh is going to evolve and varies between the age, between the location, and between the circumstances. So fiqh does change. Now, let's go back to what I said about the Sharia. The Sharia doesn't change, which is erroneous answer, but I wanted to make that distinction. Even the Sharia does evolve with time because as I mentioned earlier, there's a direct connection between the Sharia and between the purposes of the Sharia. The purposes we talked about, the protection and enhancement of life, wealth, lineage, etc. So it's very possible that at a certain time, a certain ruling or a certain understanding would be enhancing lineage or life at a certain time, but would run contrary to that at later ages or in different circumstances. So you will see some variance. I also want to add a little bit of personal color here. I'm originally from Lebanon. I've lived in Lebanon when I was growing up, and I've experienced Islam or certain levels of Sharia when it comes to Sharia as applied to a family or Sharia as applied to a person or to a relationship within a community. But I've also lived in, obviously here in the United States, I've also lived in other Muslim countries such as Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and the UAE. I've also lived in London, which some would argue is a Muslim country already, and the UK. And I have to tell you, I've experienced an altogether different Islam in these different places, and a different Sharia, if you will, in these different places, because the experience has to be different and has to have a local flavor. And we heard yesterday in the speech by Imam Rauf about the importance, the critical need, really, to develop a distinctly and robust American Muslim identity. And I agree with that. I think this is really necessary. And in addition to that, and tied directly to that, is the concept of institutions, because Sharia doesn't live on its own. It has institutions that support it. And when you have these institutions, you would find Sharia could lead to moral or just results. Where you don't have the institutions, you try to apply Sharia without having the requisite institutions, you could come up with an altogether different result.
Normally, my voice can be heard without a microphone. So I'm going to ask a question, but I want to give it a little context. So the question is going to be, what are the elements of fear of Sharia law that you experience? But I want to mention two things. The first one is the fact that there are many Muslims emigrating to United States from a monolithic or a one-religion state to a pluralism. Okay, so that's one phenomenon. The other phenomenon is that, and I'm not totally familiar with, but in Saudi Arabia, not only is there a very specific brand of Islam, but there's the resources to educate peoples all over the world and try to convince Muslims that that is the way they should go. So now I'll come back to the question. So how do you interpret when Americans fear Sharia, what's the dimensions that you think they're ignorant of, or what are they missing so they wouldn't have to do that?
Okay. All right. Great question, and in fact, I really regret not crossing the street last night and talking to the people who were there and who had these signs saying, you know, Sharia is coming, essentially, and asked them really, just what is it that you're afraid of? Because it's a very valid question, and it's a very important question, and I appreciate the context that you've provided, and the concept of growing immigration, and does that lead necessarily to Sharia creeping into our country or into other societies. And this is precisely the theme that's advanced in certain European countries about Sharia, particularly in places like France and Belgium and others, whereas, you know, you have this Muslim invasion, if you will. It's a peaceful invasion, but it's an invasion in the sense of society, demographics being overwhelmed. And these people are now trying to live the same way they lived in other places and are trying to do this here, and this is fundamentally inconsistent with our values. The other point you brought about Saudi Arabia and others is also valid. We've heard about attempts at Saudi Arabia, really, and other places, Saudi Arabia, Iran, other places, trying to exert influence here in the United States through Islamic organizations, through mosques and other organizations. So these are valid concerns, and it's a correct framework for the question. Let me try maybe back up just a slight little bit and talk about, you know, what it means, this whole concept of applying Sharia, because I think this is what people are afraid of. You're going to apply Sharia here, you're going to impose your Sharia, you're going to apply it here. What does that really mean? And, you know, I have to tell you that, well, I mean, Sharia applies in the context of an individual. So when I try to apply Sharia in my own life, it means I, you know, remember to set aside a certain portion of my savings to give to the poor. So for me, that's part of applying Sharia. When I try to, there's a concept of applying Sharia within a family. So issues relating to the rights of a spouse or looking after elderly parents. So this is part of the Sharia. And I can think that the people who are holding up these signs are really worried about these things. I mean, because these are things we all do, and we all do for essentially the same reason. We want to be good people, and to those who believe in a hereafter, we want to be rewarded accordingly, and we don't want to be punished for failing to do that. So there's that, and I think that in the context of this wave of immigrants coming, I think, you know, it's a good news, bad news situation. The people coming here are going to bring that with them. I mean, if they worship a certain way, or the kind of interaction they have at home within the family is a certain way, they are going to bring it. So the people who are afraid of the Sharia, I have to say, to a certain extent, you're right. Sharia is coming with those people, because these people are applying Sharia in their own homes and in the ways that they lead their lives. You can see sometimes Sharia being applied in a business context, and I've experienced that quite a bit in light of my practice on advising on structuring things in a way that complies with Islamic transactions, Islamic finance, etc. Sometimes you see Sharia applied in community organizations. I've belonged and I've helped establish certain Muslim organizations in this area and in California, where I've lived before. And one of the things organizations always like to put in their bylaws is, we will follow the laws of the Sharia. And it sounds great. It sounds like you're giving a Friday sermon, but it's something like this doesn't. If there's a dispute, which is why these bylaws are for, something like this isn't going to be particularly helpful. But what these organizations try to mean is that there is this notion in Sharia about the value of consultation. There's a direct order in the Quran to Prophet Muhammad during his life as a prophet, when he was receiving revelation, saying, and consult them in their affairs. So it's a direct order to the Prophet to consult the broader community. So when Muslim organizations put in their bylaws, will abide by Sharia, it means you will have mechanisms for consulting with the broader community about the types of activities you do within your organization, about the way you run your organization, etc. Now, there is also the concept of Sharia at a state level. So I've mentioned before that I've had quite a bit of interaction actually in Saudi law within the context of Saudi courts, and their Sharia is the law of the land. And I've also dealt in other Muslim countries where maybe they don't make as much noise about it, but also Sharia is definitely part of the law. And it's when you go to court, the judge is going to ask, what does the Sharia say about this in general? So in the context of a state, Sharia means laws that are in general compliance with this path that I told you about, this moral system. And this is where Islamic law and Halakha have a lot in common, the concept about applying the law of the land. The law of the land is considered to be it's an important source of Sharia, but also the agreements that people reach within themselves. There's a rule in fiqh that says the contract is the Sharia of the contracting parties. So what people agree to, the covenant, is their own Sharia. So in the context of a state, of a nation state, for instance, or other type of a state, the Sharia means the governance of the state, the general contract between the governed and the governors, and the ruled and the rulers. And there, you see, and certainly today you see a lot of abuse. And me as a Muslim, I think of myself as a practicing Muslim. I don't, particularly have any claims to being totally devout, but I'd like as much as possible to live a life of that's consistent with this Sharia. I'm often very troubled by this whole concept of applying Sharia when it comes at the state level, because in some ways, Sharia is also, in sort of modern Islamic movement parlance, Sharia is also a euphemism for one man, emphasis on man rule. This whole concept of a khilafah or a caliphate with one Khalifa or one caliph or one ruler heading that state is one that is a bit, it's worrisome to me because it doesn't benefit from the collective knowledge and the collective human experience about different forms of government that allow for justice and that allow for this concept of consultation that we talked about. This is an area where there's abuse, and I think this is where a lot of the fear is about. It's about somebody coming over from a foreign land with a thick accent like mine and trying to impose a different law on society as a whole, or trying to run the country in a different way. And I think this is really where the fear is coming from. But I don't think this is particularly a rational fear. And some of the things that are happening and are happening today in the Muslim world show that this may not be necessarily a rational fear. I mean, you see the people who are demonstrating in the streets of Cairo and Tunis and Benghazi and other places. They're not asking for one-man rule. They're not asking for a theocratic system to be in place. They're asking for basic human rights. They're asking for their voices to be heard and for them to have input into how the state is governed and how their life is governed. So I think this fear about a sort of a super state or a state that's Sharia-based is overblown. It's not entirely rational, and it's one that's largely rejected by Muslims in general. And I'm not talking only about secular Muslims. I think about across society of Muslims in general.
Just picking up on what you were saying, because I think that's what Phil was talking about is largely the question I wanted to ask, so I just want to maybe put a little nuance on it. Because I remember growing up as a Jew and figuring out halakha as opposed to the law of the land and I remember being asked when it was clear that a particular element in Israel was throwing rocks at anybody going through this driving on the Sabbath. And if there had been a sudden influx into the United States at that moment of Orthodox Jews, and there was this example of a few people throwing rocks, are you going to try to impose that here? Now, I have never thrown a rock in my life, at a car. But I guess what I wanted to go back to, as far as what I'm curious about with Sharia, is what demands are made of one's relationship, as you started to say, but I really would like to have more of the relationship to the law of the land. And I think part of the fear, again, if we take it back to when I was a kid and some of the people were talking about those, as they put it, those nutcases who won't let you drive on a Saturday. The fear of Muslims coming here and wanting to change the secular law to adhere to this concept. And I guess what I would really love to understand better is the relationship that you see between the law as is spiritually asked of you, and the law that you are trying to make a part of the community around you, regardless of someone's spiritual orientation, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Let me address this as as Salah here, as me speaking as a person. I've mentioned that I've lived in different countries and different Muslim countries, maybe not so Muslim countries. I have to say that I've never felt, whether as a child or as an adult, as comfortable in being a Muslim as I do here, living in the United States, and I've had that experience. Not only I grew up somewhere else and I came here and I've seen the light. No, I mean I've also traveled abroad as an adult, and I worked in Saudi Arabia for a few years, Dubai, all these other places. And I have to say that in many ways, my understanding of the Sharia and my understanding of what Islam requires, that this land is not only hospitable to that, but it's one that's very conducive and in many ways very spiritually rewarding. And so I don't necessarily see that there's that inherent tension between the laws of the land and between the whether it's the body of Sharia or the baggage that people who are recent immigrants normally come with to this area. So this is my sort of personal experience. Okay, let me separate personal a little bit. There's, I mentioned before that the custom or law of the land is part of the law, and that's understood, and that's not a question of debate within the context of Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic Sharia. The way that sometimes I've heard this explained to people, it's interesting. I mean, I've heard an imam at the masjid, say, look, when you came here, you got a visa, right? Okay, and the visa says, by accepting this visa and getting it fixed on your passport, you're accepting to abide by the laws of the land that has given you this visa. Or by taking an oath of citizenship, you're agreeing to uphold the laws of the United States. So that becomes then becomes a religious obligation on you, because you have taken that kind of covenant or that kind of agreement upon yourself. And that's something I've heard quite a bit in different mosques here in the US, where sometimes people I've heard the other argument, and the reason why this comment came up is, I've heard somebody say, Sheikh, this law, they don't respect the laws of Allah. Is it okay to just use, these credit cards, they take interest on them, and we know that's forbidden. Is it okay to go use the credit card and never pay my debts on it? So sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes not so well-intentioned. Questions about this dichotomy or dissonance or between the law of the land and Sharia, and this is where these types of explanations kind of come through. But honestly, I don't even see the need for these kinds of explanations, because here, this is the definition of Sharia is where you find justice, you'll find Sharia, and if you can't find justice here, then God help us all.
I guess if we have one very, very quick question, otherwise we need to break for the, sure. Yeah. So it has to be a quick one. Yes or no answer.
This question is addressed to both to Mr. Brooks and Mr. Dandan. Could you please give us a specific example of how American courts have recognized and enforced canon law and Sharia law, and an example of how American law and canon law or Sharia might be in conflict with American law?
Well, there really is no conflict between American law and canon law. We follow the civil laws of every state that, and we're, and what I would say every diocese. To be married in the Catholic Church, you must present yourself with a marriage certificate, and you have to follow that law. With regards to the question of where there might be a conflict, would be, for instance, let's say I'm doing a marriage case and I see that there are children in a marriage, that a man has married a Catholic woman, let's say, and he's got children from a previous marriage. One of the questions that I always would ask is, are you supporting those children according to civil law? And if I find that that is not the case, then we have the power to say, you need to take care of that before you can be married in the church, if we allow that. And then sometimes I ask the question, how far are you behind? And so I say, you need to take care of that, and you must take care of that with regards to the civil law. We follow that. Also, if you're asking to be for a declaration of invalidity, you must already be divorced civilly. We do not, we don't touch a marriage case until somebody has been civilly divorced. We follow, and the church does follow in other countries. I think in France you have to have a civil ceremony before you're married, before you can have a religious ceremony. I'm not sure about that, but I think that might be, and we respect that. We respect most laws of every state and in most countries. So there really isn't a conflict between our church law and civil law. So we pretty well.
All right, the condensed version of the answer. So instances of U.S. courts applying Sharia law, yes, in matters of wills, for instance, where a will is drafted in accordance with the Sharia, in matters of prenuptial agreements and things like that, yes, absolutely. Instances of conflict, I can think of one example, for instance, on the issue of polygamy, where it's also permitted, not required, the same distinction. Here, it's not permitted. And I've heard several Islamic scholars say, because here it's not permitted, then Islamically or religiously, it's also not permitted. Because polygamy, for it to be acceptable, there has to be equal treatment of all wives. And if the law recognizes only one wife but does not recognize the other, then by necessity, there cannot be an equal treatment.
Thank you all, and now we are up in the cathedral for the interfaith service.